There's a huge update coming to Lightroom and I'm really excited to talk about it. We're getting a Vectorscope, and it's probably right around the corner because Adobe Camera Raw already has this feature. And the truth is that I've been using an external Vectorscope for more than a year, and it's a great tool for photography even though most people never even heard of it. And as a photographer, I've been using it for various tasks throughout my editing process. You can use a Vectorscope to set a proper white balance, make sure that your skin tones look nice and natural, or even calibrate the colors that are coming from your camera. But to do all this and a few things more related to color grading, we first need to understand what exactly a Vectorscope is and how we can use one. The one in Adobe Camera Raw looks like this. It's pretty minimalistic, but it's still really helpful. We have all the main colors going from red, yellow, green, cyan, blue and magenta. We have nice lines so we can see the axis, and we also have this line over here, which is the skin tone line. And while different Vectorscopes are gonna have slightly different user interfaces, they all function basically the same. We get the circle of colors, and the pixels from our photo get sorted by color, and the closer to the middle of the circle they are, the less saturated they are. But the further we go from the middle, that means that our colors are getting more and more saturated. And the one in Adobe Camera Raw can be enabled by right-clicking on the histogram and choosing Show Vectorscope. Just make sure that you have the latest version of Adobe Camera Raw, or if you're watching this in the future, we probably already have this in Lightroom. But since I'm not living in the future, I'm still using a third-party solution. This one is called Scope 3, and it's based on screen capturing, so whatever is inside of this yellow rectangle, that's what the Vectorscope is displaying. And on top of a Vectorscope, I also get some RGB scopes and a parade down here. But we're gonna completely disregard those for today, and we're only going to focus on the Vectorscope. The same way that you should focus on the like and the subscribe button if you're new here and you like advanced Lightroom tutorials. And I'm gonna start by showing you how I use the Vectorscope to set a proper white balance to my image. I made a selection as big as the entire photo, and now looking at the Vectorscope, we can see all the colors in the photo rearranged on the color wheel. And the more saturated a color gets, the further away from the center of the Vectorscope is gonna get. So if I push the saturation of the entire photo, you can see how all the pixels on the Vectorscope are getting away from the circle. But if, for example, I am pushing the white balance too much to the left, we can see that all the dots on the Vectorscope are migrating towards the blue and cyan area of the color circle. And now to set a proper white balance, what I'm gonna do is use the Vectorscope to make sure that all the colors in my photo originate from the middle of the Vectorscope. Because if my white balance is off, you can see how everything gets skewed to a point where the middle of the scope is no longer centered with the center of the circle. So let's reset the white balance, and now I'm gonna push the temperature up, and you can see the orange pixels going right against the skin tone line, but the entire thing is skewed a bit towards the magenta over here, so I'm gonna be pushing just a little bit the tint to the left, and right here I think that I already have a pretty good white balance in my photo. But to make sure that everything is in place, I'm gonna boost the saturation and the vibrance, and we can see that even the highlights on her top right here are still a bit blue, so let's add a bit more warmth to the entire photo. But we were pretty close with that first initial guess, and now you can see clearly on the histogram, even better with the vibrance saturation at 100, how everything originates straight from the middle of the circle. Now let's reset the vibrance and saturation, and we have a really good starting point for the white balance of our photo. But that's not all. We don't want to go crazy and make sure that everything is perfectly centered on the Vectorscope, but instead we want to respect what's in the image, because the Vectorscope is just showing what's in our photo. So for example, if I go to another photo that I shot with a ton of foliage in the background and the sun right before sunset, we're gonna see on the Vectorscope that we have a lot of yellow tones and also a ton of green. But if I go ahead and try to fix the white balance until it's center, I'm probably gonna end up with something maybe like this that looks pretty centered on the Vectorscope. But if I'm looking at the photo, I can see that the skin tones don't really look right. So with my Vectorscope, I can now resize the capture window and focus just on his face. And just like that, we can see that this line over here is far from the skin tone line and it's pushed heavily towards magenta, and that's why his skin looks really odd. So I can push the tint back to maybe something like +10 and also play around with the temperature just a bit more, and now the skin looks much better. And even when I push vibrance and saturation to 100%, we can see that the highlight on his forehead is leaning just a bit towards magenta, and probably I should correct that, so just +10 or maybe even less in the tint channel, and everything is pretty well balanced while the sun remains pretty warm. And if I go back to my selection and make it as big as the photo while the saturation and vibrance are to 100%, we can see that everything is originating from the middle, but we still have a ton more green than we have other colors on the Vectorscope, because that's just the nature of what's in the photo. So the same way we don't want to use a histogram to perfectly balance out a photo that's, let's say, a silhouette, which is going to have a ton of dark tones, we also don't want to use a Vectorscope to fix the white balance in a photo that was shot in maybe very colorful light, or compensate for things like a ton of foliage in the background like you've seen in the previous example. But there's one more thing we have to be mindful of. The Vectorscope can actually be influenced by our exposure. As you can see now, the scope is displaying pretty much everything right around the middle of the circle. But if I push my exposure up quite significantly, the Vectorscope exploded with color, showing me a lot more about the info in the photo. And that's not because the Vectorscope is actually reactive to exposure. That's because of the color model that Lightroom uses to display our photos. And this is perfectly illustrated in this graphic from the Canon website, where we can see that the model that Lightroom is using, HSL, is reducing saturation towards the ends of the spectrum. So very bright and very dark areas of the spectrum are getting desaturated, where by contrast an HSB or HSV model would have maximum saturation throughout the entire luminosity spectrum. So going back to my underexposed photo, if I fix the exposure, you can see that the Vectorscope is expanding, but if I use the curve to fully overexpose the photo, you can see how the Vectorscope is starting to retract back towards the middle of the circle, because pure white lives in the middle of the Vectorscope. And this entire discussion about color models is not that important for white balance, but it's really important if you want to use a color checker like this one to calibrate the colors that you're getting from your camera. This is a color checker video from Data Color, and it has all the 6 main colors and a patch of skin tones color, but you will see this much better if I turn it around. As I said, if I'm turning it around, where you can see all the 6 main colors that you are seeing on the Vectorscope as well, and a row of skin tones over here. And now let me show you how I'm using this color checker combined with a Vectorscope to get better colors from my Sony camera. I'm starting by moving the selection so it includes only the color checker, and I'm gonna use the gray patch over here to set my white balance, and just to make sure that it looks right, I'm gonna push it to 100% saturation and vibrance. Maybe my skin is a bit too warm for my taste, so I'm going to knock it down just a tiny bit. And because my beard is showing signs of magenta, I'm also going to push some green into the shadows to neutralize that as well. But that's pretty much it. I'm resetting the white balance right now, and I'm doing all this because, as you just saw, setting the white balance purely on the card is not necessarily that accurate. I'm trying to make sure that the person in the photo is actually looking good, so even though I have the skin tones on the color checker, I'm making sure that the white balance in the photo looks good based on the people in the photo. But with that out of the way, we have 6 lines, each of them going directly to one of the pure color, or at least in the general direction, and we also have a line that's going slightly parallel to the skin tone line. The red one is pointing slightly to the right of the checkbox with the red right next to it. So I'm gonna use the hue in the HSL tab to move that around, and you can see when I'm dragging on the slider that the color of my shirt changes, but also the line on the Vectorscope is changing its direction, and I'm gonna try and make it point directly to the red square over here. Now let's quickly move through all of them. The yellow one doesn't need much adjustment, the green one is pretty much on point. I'm gonna move the cyan just slightly towards left, and the biggest difference is with magenta. So I'm gonna drag on the magenta slider over here and make sure that it's pointing directly at the magenta square on the vector scope. Something like this is probably good enough. Maybe I'll adjust the cyan just a bit more. And with these tweaks to my hues, I now know that I have better colors in my photo, and a much better base means that I'm gonna get a much better color grade down the line. But I said better colors, and that's not exactly right until I also tweak the saturation and the luminance, because as you can see right now, these lines are not equally long, and that means that some of the colors are much more saturated on my camera than the other ones. So to address that, I'm now going to play with the saturation and luminance, but I'm gonna be keeping in mind the color model that I'm working with. So I can shorten the line for yellow either by reducing its luminance or by reducing the saturation. And if I see that I have to heavily reduce the saturation of one channel to get the line short enough to match the other ones, I'd prefer to lower the luminance a bit as well and mix both of these two until the color patches look right. And I can always make sure that they look right by comparing what I see on the screen with what I have in my hand. This is another really useful tip. Whenever you're just checking to make sure that it looks right, make sure that you use the physical object that you have in your hand. So back to our edits, I'm also going to reduce the luminance in the reds just a tiny bit and massively reduce the luminance and the saturation in the green channel to make sure that that line is not super long anymore. I'm also going to add a bit of luminance in the blues because that line was pretty short over here, and I'm also going to reduce the saturation of the cyan or aqua just a tiny bit because this line over here looks a bit long to me. But just like that, I now have pretty equal lines except for the red, which is still a bit too long, so maybe something like this is much better. And now let's toggle on and off the color mixer to see the effect that this had on my photo. It doesn't look like much on the entire photo, but pay attention on the color checker and you can see how much closer these tones are right now. And with this good of a base, when I'm going to apply a color response curve, let's do with something super simple like Kodak Color 200, you can see how much better my film emulation is compared to how it would look like if I toggle off the entire HSL panel. And if you're wondering what color response curves are, that's my way of emulating the colors of film without using all the tools in Lightroom. I'm only using the red, green and blue curves to get a color response that's similar to the film stock. And you can find these color response curves on my website, and you're gonna be supporting my channel as well if you buy any of them. Now, going back to our photo, I usually like to check the colors of my skin tones after applying my color response curve. So I'm resizing the selection over here, just making sure that it's selecting my face. And now I'm looking at the Vectorscope and we can see that the colors in the photo are right against the skin tone line, maybe leaning a bit yellow, and I can address that by moving around the white balance slider just a bit more towards magenta. And honestly, using the skin tone line in the Vectorscope is one of the easiest way to make sure that skin tones look right in the final edit. But before we can talk about final edits, let's talk about how to use a Vectorscope to make sure that we get a good color grade. And for this example, I'm gonna be using this studio shot that I took earlier this year. And first of all, I'm gonna apply a Kodak 2383 camera profile, which makes the entire photo look very bluish. So I'm going to compensate the white balance for that to something like this. And I'm also going to apply some color response curve, maybe something like Hectare 100 would be a nice fit, but again we can see that this pushed the entire image really far into the greens, so let's compensate for that as well and maybe add a bit more warmth to the entire photo. And I'm doing all this while watching the Vectorscope because what I want to see is a bit of complementary colors going on. And the thing with this photo is that it's really dark and moody, so the color response curve reacted to that moodiness and applied mostly the colors that we get in the darker areas of the film. So I had to compensate for that, and the Vectorscope was really useful because I could see in real time where exactly my colors sit compared to the middle or neutral tones. And even with all this compensation, I'm still getting the colors that I would normally get from that specific film stock, but I make sure that my photo is well balanced. But now, I still want my image to lean warm with mostly warm tones in it, but I still want my skin to go right against the skin tone line, maybe leaning yellow a tiny bit, but I'm also looking at this area over here, which is the blue that I have in the shadows. And we can accentuate that by boosting our saturation a bit, but going further down the line, I'm going to use the color grading wheels to do exactly that. But first of all, let's move the skin tones against my skin tone line, and to do that, I'm going to push a bit more warmth into the image and also a bit more magenta until the photo looks something like this. And now let's do a bit of color grading. I want more blues into my shadows, so I'm gonna add probably something like saturation 10 or even less, but I'm playing around and you can see how the Vectorscope is slowly reacting to this because I have the balance of the color wheels slightly towards the highlights. And that's again because the photo is rather underexposed, and with the balance slider in the middle, the shadow color grading wheel will affect most of the photo, while the highlights and the midtones would be heavily underrepresented. So I moved the balance to the right in order to get a more balanced look to my photo. And with that balance slider pointed towards the highlights, you can see that the shadow color wheel is not affecting the image so much, but I'm still gonna park it in the cool tones and move on with my edit. In my midtones, I wanna add a bit of orange to make the skin tones look even better, and again, I'm not going to push very heavily the saturation slider, maybe something like 15 or just a bit more. And now, for the highlights, because we can see on the histogram that this photo is a bit underrepresented in the bright areas, we can push the whites, but this creates too much contrast, and instead I'm going to use the color grading wheel to brighten up the highlights in the photo. I'm not adding any hue to this, but you can see the effect that this has on my photo just about instantly when I'm adding luminance with about 16%. And that's of course if I'm going for a complementary look that on a Vectorscope looks like a straight diagonal line, but I could also be going for a photo like this one where I'm having a more analog color palette, that meaning that I'm picking 2 or 3 colors that are similar to each other, but I can see better on the Vectorscope how they span across the color circle. And if I want to tweak things, like for example, let's say that I want to do my reds a bit more magenta and spread that out pretty far, I think it's really easy to do that with a Vectorscope because I know exactly how far apart my hues are. And the Vectorscope is even more useful when you're going for something like a triadic color mix. Let's say you want to adjust the color of a piece of garment like my pink hat over here, and you can see on the Vectorscope how it falls in line to contrast with the background or any other object that's already in the scene. But I'm not going to dive too deep into this topic because that's heavily dependent on the photo that you're working on. But if you want to chat more about one of these really advanced topics, you can use the contact form on my website and we can set up a one-to-one Skype call because I also do this type of workshops. But now I want to show you one more trick. Back in Lightroom, I have this photo that I purposely messed up the colors in to simulate the green color cast that you will get when you're shooting under the canopy in the forest or just in a park with a lot of vegetation during the day. And we can see that I have the square selected right on my face and the skin tones are leaning left, but they are starting from the center, just that they're going outwards more towards yellow than they probably should. And we could try and fix that by adding a lot of magenta into the photo, and that can actually put our skin tones in line, but it's gonna mess up the look of the other things in the photo. So I'm gonna undo this, and instead I'm going to create a select all mask by pressing Shift Q on the keyboard, which creates a luminance range mask. And in here, I'm going to use the hue slider to rotate the entire color palette in my photo to the left just a bit more. Something like -8 hue should be enough. And you can see that I maintained the relationship between all my colors, but I just rotated the entire color wheel so the skin tones are starting to look right. And this is one of those things that's rather awkward to do in Lightroom. I'm pushing left on the hue slider and the colors in my color palette are rotating right on the Vectorscope. And a similar thing happens with the color wheels. They're not aligned with the Vectorscope, so whenever you're pushing the colors around, you're gonna see the tones on the Vectorscope going in a completely different direction. But I really hope that that gets fixed before they release a Vectorscope in Lightroom and we get a much better user interface. But anyway, that was it for today. That's how I use a Vectorscope when I'm editing my photos. I hope that you learned something new, and if you have any other use cases for a Vectorscope while editing photos, let me know in the comments down below. Thank you for watching, don't forget to hit the like and the subscribe button on your way out, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!